Well, welcome to the European Study Center on the penultimate week of our term. We are very, very pleased to have our panel today talk about the new German government. Very topical, very interesting, and we're all curious to know much more about it. And for that, we are grateful to Andreas Busch, who has agreed to talk to us about this. Andreas is a professor of comparative politics and political economy at the Department of Politics of Göttingen University. But he's somebody who's very well known here in Oxford because he spent a big part of his career at the Department of Politics and International Relations. He was teaching there for a number of years. He's also been a fellow at St. Antony's College and Hereford College. So he very much knows the place. And he has come back for this term at the European Study Center as an academic visitor to work on his various projects, and among others also German politics today. On that, he's going to speak to us. And we're looking forward to what you have to say, Andreas. And also with Timothy Garton, our very own Timothy, that knows Germany very, very well as well. And he will also speak about this topic after Andreas' talk. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Othon. And let me just say that I'm immensely grateful to the center, but also to you personally, that I could spend this term here. It's been great to be back. The whole idea about whatever the new government would be to work on that emerged over a cup of coffee with Tim last November, 2 or 3 days after the Scholz government had collapsed. So I'm grateful, and I'm also quite interested. I find it interesting how much interest there is in the UK about the new government. It has come into office on the 6th of May, so it's something like 35 days. It rests on a coalition of the CDU and the CDU, CSU, and the SPD. And it's a government that has inherited a number of challenges, at least the challenges that its predecessor collapsed over. After the German general election of February, so which one is that? You have to point the computer. I have to point something at the computer.
I didn't think we were ready.
Oh, no, fine. Let's just so. Okay, great. So you guessed that. Do I press the red one or the? Wave and you will.
Oh.
Okay. The number of challenges. The result of the general election has produced a situation that is quite unparalleled. I'll talk about that. There's also a number of domestic challenges that I will focus on. Migration and economic stagnation are very visible, and I'll also talk about the geopolitical situation, which is in flux, I should say, we'll say a few things about how Merz is so far coping with that. So these are the 3 points that I want to focus on. But before I start with that, let me have a brief recap of the results of the February 25 general election for the Bundestag. Let me see. Okay, now it works. Wonderful. Just to jog your memory how things, what the results were. you can see the composition of the Bundestag here, and you will see that the Christian Democrats and the CDU and the CSU, I will now just for simplicity's sake only refer to the CDU. If there are any Bavarians in the room, I beg their forgiveness. It's not against them, but it's just easier. So a gain of 4.4 percentage points is not impressive given the collapse and the unpopularity, at least towards the end of the Scholz government. Then we have the AfD, the right-wing extremist party, two parts at least, right-wing extremist party, which literally doubled its share of the vote from 10.4 to 20.8%. This is absolutely unprecedented. It also means that any attempts that have been undertaken so far to rein in the AfD can only be considered as having completely failed. So these modest and substantial gains contrast with clear losses for all parties that were involved in the Scholz government, the so-called traffic light coalition composed of the Social Democrats, the Liberals and the Greens. Massive losses for the Social Democrats, more than 9 percentage points. You can see that here, down to 16.4. Just to say that this is their worst election result in more than 100 years. A substantial loss for the Greens, who only a year and a half earlier still were polling above 20%. So if you compare it to the last election, it's not that bad, but compared to what they expected of themselves, it is quite bad. And a catastrophic loss for the Liberals, who lose almost 2/3 of their votes, of their vote share, and at 4.3% are not even in striking distance of the 5% hurdle in the Bundestag. And then a substantial improvement for the Left Party, as you can see, 8.8%. A party which seemed moribund and actually destined for extinction only a few months before the election, and where many observers expected that they would be replaced in the favor of the voters by the one-woman show that is the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, who failed the 5% hurdle by the slimmest of margins, managing 4.98%. Or missing only 13,000 votes. I can tell you that I waited during the night until 3 or 4 o'clock until all the votes were counted, and it was extremely slim. It was just half an hour before the end. They were still at 5.02, and then West German votes came in, and of course there was a clear distinction between in the distribution between the West and the East. So this is the situation, and you can see that it has changed quite considerably compared to the previous Bundestag. There are 2 fewer parties in there because the Liberals did not manage, and the BSW also did not manage. They, however, of course, split in the during the last Bundestag. If we take a long view, just to give you an idea where the parties came from, you can see that how the formerly big parties, or also often called people's parties, the Volksparteien, have come down over the last decades from vote shares which were around 40% to clearly much smaller vote shares. So you have a combination of they're coming up new parties. The Greens were the first, then the Left Party came, then the AfD came. So we have a combination of the big parties becoming smaller, but also more parties being in the game. And this has actually not changed very much. Just to give you an idea, this is the most recent poll from the polling firm I trust most, the Forschungsgruppe Wahlen, which has no commercial interests. It's run by one of the public service broadcasters. So you see that the CDU has sort of is roughly where it was. The AfD has, if anything, slightly gained. The SPD has slightly lost. If you look at the Left Party, you can see that they have actually gained quite a bit. and you can see that both the BSW and the FDP will probably not play a role in the foreseeable future and may well be destined for extinction, which in the case of the FDP, of course, would be a considerable change, because liberalism, of course, is one of the big pillars of liberal democracy. So this is a brief recap. Let's have a look at on the first as the first part. What is the coalition that the Merz government would have rests upon? And I will argue that it is a somewhat fragile coalition, because both constituent parties have some trouble. Clearly, to begin, the Merz government is now the Merz, who took 3 attempts to become the leader of the party after Merkel withdrew. The CDU is clearly now in the post-Merkel era, and like Merkel did when she took over in 2005, in the early 2000s, there was a new basic program of the CDU in 2007. Now Merz has done the same thing. There is a new basic program, and it has shifted the CDU's position slightly in a more conservative direction, particularly on issues like migration. It's when in 2007 everything was about Germany as a country of broad integration and sort of welcoming. Now the focus is more strongly on limiting migration, on emphasis on integration, but also on other things that you find subtle and not quite so subtle shifts in a more conservative direction. At the same time, of course, you find a very clear distancing towards the AfD. That's always something that is being asked about the CDU. It's quite clear, and I talk about this later. These two parties are like they are at each other's throats, and the AfD wants, at least large parts of it, wants to annihilate the CDU. So the CDU has quite clearly proclaimed that the AfD are their arch enemy. There are a number of challenges, however, that the CDU faces as well. They're a broad church in terms of the ideological background and preferences, particularly around issues like foreign policy or the Ukraine war. Merz has a balancing act to fulfill, and the CDU in the West also is, for example, in North Rhine-Westphalia, very successful in forming a coalition with the Greens, a party that Merz has very strongly attacked in the campaign, but has since had to behave quite pragmatically towards. So that's one problem in a way, or a potential point of fragility. The other is that Merz, again, to his credit, one could argue, has behaved quite pragmatically when looking at the changed situation. He completely, can either say, ate his words, behaved pragmatically, or broke his promises, depending on your point of view, when he forgot all his promises about maintaining the debt brake, which is famously inscribed in the German constitution. And I can only say when it was instituted in 2011, I think it was broadly consented across all parties, particularly also by the Social Democrats, that has now been seen as a problem. And because the AfD and the left party, so the right and left extreme parties, have more than a third of the seats in the new Bundestag, you cannot change the constitution, and the constitutional change was required to modify the debt brake. So this was done in the period between when the old parliament was still sitting, quite quickly, but this met quite a bit of criticism from the fiscal conservatives in the CDU. However, perhaps one last point. Merz's main potential competitor, sort of from the conservative wing of the CDU, is now the floor leader, Jens Spahn. And he's somebody to watch out for. He's not in the cabinet. He's also which means he's not in the cabinet discipline. But he was clearly strong, or so strong that he could not be sidelined completely, as others have been sidelined. So Merz has actually brought in quite a lot of new faces and several people, not least in foreign policy, who expected to be rewarded for their many years of work in the opposition were not given posts. Generally, I would expect the CDU, like most center-right parties, to behave pragmatically, though, and to support Merz as long as he keeps the CDU in government. So this hiccup in the first round of voting, when he did not get the required absolute majority of the seats to become the federal chancellor, I would interpret as a hiccup, more in any case than a organized something there.
Sorry.
It's certainly not an organized rebellion. So far, no more problems have appeared. If we look at the other party, it's also in a fragile situation. It's reeling from its worst election result. I talked about that. At the same time, one of the co-leaders, one of the two leaders, Lars Klingbeil, has clearly conducted a power grab. He is now the new finance minister, and he has sidelined his former co-chair, Saskia Esken, who voluntarily or not so voluntarily will not stand for re-election. There'll be somebody else, Albert Baas, the new Minister of Labour. There is a debate about where the party will position itself. If you look at the losses that the SPD has suffered, it's quite clear that it lost 1.7 million voters to the CDU, 0.7 million to the AfD, compared to 500,000 to the left and 100,000 to the Greens. So they clearly would, to react to that, would assume that you try to move to the center. On the other hand, the competition in the Bundestag is from the Greens and from the left party, and it's likely that the Greens will move more strongly to the left again. So let's see how that goes. The party convention at the end of June in Berlin will be very interesting. This will, I would expect, as of on sort of information as of today, to consolidate Klingbeil's leadership, who has handled this quite shrewdly. This is, I think, the long-term best prospect for the SPD to regain some of its strength. This all is happening under the shadow of the AfD. Sorry, I forgot this one. Sorry, but okay. Okay. Just to remind you that the AfD started its life as a party centered on worries about the stability of the euro as a currency. So it's a fiscally conservative party, which after the migration wave of 2015 massively shifted towards anti-migration stance and then gained electoral success. It's a party that has various parts, and public focus is very strongly on the extremist part, but one must also recognize that there are substantial parts in the party, and it's a shifting situation, who actually say that they should moderate. They should, their main task should be to become a viable coalition partner for the CDU by 2028, i.e. in time for the next general election. So it's interesting to see the other parties have tried to completely block and the AfD, for example, hasn't got any positions in the Bundestag. It doesn't have a vice presidency of the Bundestag. It does not have any committee chairmanships, which is from a parliamentary point of view at least questionable, because it means that 20% of the electorate are not represented on that level in parliament. So I would expect the AfD also to be internally at least have some discussions between the extremists and the pragmatists. And also, it'll be interesting to see how the voters will react if the AFD cannot show anything, rather than sort of sitting there and making foul-mouthed comments to much of the parliamentary debate over a number of years. As I said, the strategy has evidently been unsuccessful. I think it would be necessary to actually check the viability of this strategy, but the other parties feel comfortable and so far have not indicated any desire to change that strategy. It plays into the hands of the AFD, however, which can portray itself as being badly treated, victimized, and so on. The last question on the slide is, of course, if you are in favor of inclusion for every group, can you actually credibly exclude 20% of the electorate? And I think that is something that will come back to become a major point of discussion. Let me now come to the two challenges that I talked about. They are migration and economic stagnation, and again start with a number of empirical information. If you look at this data, it's the compiled numbers of what Germans consider to be the most pressing problems. And you can see that migration, which is the migration integration, it's the red line, sort of features extremely prominently after 2015, only to be then towards the 2020s be surpassed by the issue of climate and energy, which they lump together. But you can see towards the end of the period, again, the migration issue goes up. This means that this has been a pressing issue for a very long time. It's been a problem, it's been a driver for AFD success, particularly after 2015. And let me show you one more slide with numbers. This is the position. This is a survey from the German long-term election study. This is the most recent installment from February 2025. This is the situation immediately before the general election. What does it mean? It says it's an 11-point scale. You can see that you're asked whether you think that regulations towards migration should remain as they are. That would be the medium position 6. It should be sort of it should be eased. Regulation should be eased. That is 1 to 4, 1 to 5, or it should actually be tightened, and that is 7 to 11. You can see that, and this is quite stable, although not to this extreme. You can see that there is a clear majority towards tightening. This has been a stable result. I can tell you, having crunched the numbers for the last 15 years, since 2010. I didn't check it prior to that, but I don't think it was a necessity. And you can, I would interpret the towering 11 point, so it's an extreme point where you could see a third of the respondents are at sort of massive frustration with this. The dotted line is the mean, so it means that roughly 50% of the respondents are on either side of the dotted line, and the dots that you see, the colored dots, are the perceived positions of the parties in the Bundestag. So you can see that almost all of the parties are on one side of the dotted line, and only the AFD is on the other side. And if you do this over the longer term, which I won't bore you with, you can see that this was a completely empty space until after 2015, when the AFD, which initially had been quite close to the CSU, moved into this space, and the salience of the issue of migration went up dramatically. So migration, as you can see, is an important topic. It's a question about responsiveness of parties towards the electorate, and this clearly has not taken place. This is still a topic that is very contentious in German politics. There are those who say that actually it's not at all a problem. This is all just right-wing extremist propaganda. For example, have the numbers here. There are, as of late 2024, 3.5 million refugees in Germany, of which 1.1 million are Ukrainian refugees. And the reply to that by the spokesperson on refugee affairs from the left party was that was only 4% of the population and nobody should bother about it. This is clearly not, but you see the two sides of the argument. One side says basically, there's nothing to see here, please move on. The other side, as you could see on the previous slides, finds this is a most pressing issue. The question is, how can you deal with this as a new government? How can you be seen to make progress or to initiate change when at the same time you are tightly bound by legal rules on the European level? It's the EU system is by many considered as dysfunctional. It's also internally incoherent, and it contradicts German national law. Of course, it is considered to be superior, but this is a point where I think one of the great fights is now being fought, because there is political pressure that just does not go down, while at the same time an attempt to just barricade behind legal rules will eventually, and I think today is the 40th anniversary of the Schengen Agreement, so it's a good point to say that, this will just endanger all the achievements. So some flexibility is probably required, and the question is, how will the Merz government cope with this? Just as an example, because I say here the problems are on the communal level, it's quite clear that a lot of the communes think they are overburdened. At this number of people that have to be somehow housed, fed, and so on, there is a problem. The decisions, however, are taken at the lofty heights of the Bundestag, where these problems do not exist. I have an example here because that's from near to where I grew up in Bavaria. I stumbled across this at the end of last year. This is Bayra-Wies. I grew up something like 30 kilometers from there. It's in the southeast of Munich. It's a tiny little hamlet with 280 inhabitants, and they were asked to set up a refugee camp there which would house 128 refugees. And the person who initiated the protest movement against that was the head of the local Green Party. So you can see, I mean, if you look at the numbers, you can see there is clearly a problem. There are, for example, no doctors in Bayra-Wies. You need to have a bus. At the same time, of course, the level of government above that initiated that needs to put them somewhere where they actually have room that they own, so where they have a meadow where they can put up the temporary housing and all that. This is the problem on the ground that has quite clearly in many communes and across many parties on the communal level let grow the agreement that there needs to be some rest, some a break, but at the same time, on the federal level, there is no agreement on that. So to solve that, and to solve that in a way that is perceived as being solved, is a very tricky problem, given the given European integration and the problem that many refugees want to actually, in violating the Dublin system rules, actually do not stay and are not registered where they first enter EU soil, but move on towards the country that they see as desirable, and that's Germany, but it's also, as you know, in this country, it's also the UK. Let me move on to the economic point. This is where you can see that Germany hasn't had any economic growth since prior to the pandemic. So the economy has been stagnant for a number of years. And this is due to a number of causes, but of course it causes lots of problems, even if they are not quite as in the past, for example, express themselves through high levels of unemployment. It's clear that there are deep structural problems. Germany, by comparison, has a relatively high level of manufacturing compared to many other countries. It also has a very high level of energy-intense production. It also famously has an economy that thrives on or is dependent on exports around the world, creating lots of export trade surpluses. And of course, in an age of, say, the Trump tariff, this is a great problem and a problem that needs to be solved. However, the problem is that for structural problems and problems of industry focused on exports, there is no quick solution. On the other hand, quick fixes are needed for political reasons. Germany needs to be seen to become, to improve its economic situation. It needs to restart a stagnant economy, and that's going to be problematic. The present government, and this is where Lars Klingbeil comes into the game, the new finance minister and SPD co-chair, has now initiated this wonderful German word, the Investitionssofortprogramm. So it's a sort of something that should immediately help. And what you can do immediately is basically fiscal policy measures. And so they focus mainly on business by adding special and digressive write-off regulations and lowering business taxes over a number of years. This is all geared to very quickly boost investment. There is a political restriction that the government faces, which means that in 18 months' time, in the autumn of 2026, there will be a number of regional elections in the east of Germany, and that's where the AfD is likely to perform very strongly. So their attempt is to get things moving before that, and whether that is going to be possible is indeed something that you can wonder about. There is some sort of tension here. Much of the immediate, the Investitionssofortprogramm, the immediate program has dangers of what I've termed here a sugar rush, because it sort of quickly lets things get moving, but there is a capacity problem in much of the German economy, which has to do with labor shortages due to demographic developments. And there is a danger that if there are capacity constraints and you actually sort of put a lot of money into it, this will just flare up as inflationary pressure. So there are serious problems here, I think, particularly between what you can achieve in the short term and what you need to achieve in the long term. So there is a substantial problem that the government is facing. I'm not going to go into details about the debt brake. You know that I mentioned that briefly. The debt brake has been reduced, but perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion if you're interested. I'm not going to go into the details here. I'm also I just want to mention that there are, of course, structural changes the government intends to initiate, mainly around digitalization. But having spent an hour this lunchtime talking to a legislator about the Land of Hesse's ideas about digitalization, I can tell you, don't worry, it won't be too fast. And if you have 16 lenders, it's just very difficult. Let me come to after having covered the domestic aspects, to the foreign policy points, and here talk about the shifting geopolitical situation. Chancellor Merz, even long before he became Chancellor, has pledged to restore Germany's influence in Europe. declaring that Germany is back. Was not a very high hurdle given the, I don't want to be unfriendly, say, ineffectiveness of Chancellor Scholz in that respect. There were Merz made quite substantial efforts, I think, to pay visits to Paris, to Warsaw, to Brussels, to Kiev, to signal a departure and signal his intent to rebuild good bilateral relations, also on the personal level. This is something that Merz is clearly very focused on. You could also see that last week in his journey to the United States, his time in the Oval Office. I have it on good authority that he prepared for that extremely well. He didn't want it to blow up. He even had a telephone call with Cyril Ramaphosa to have it sort of from first-hand experience how it is to sit next to Donald Trump and be prepared to be prepared for everything. Merz will focus on strengthening European defense, and as you all know, this is something that sits a bit uneasily with the EU as it is constructed as an entity. But we know, and we've heard it talk about this several weeks ago here, the EU is also dealing with that problem. How that is going to be solved, particularly if you want to include into that countries that are outside the European Union, such as the United Kingdom, but also Norway, is going to be a challenge. Merz has very clearly tried to revive the Franco-German relationship that never worked. Scholz and Macron just never clicked. And of course, there are also very clearly better contacts to the UK on the agenda. And it's a very a symbol to that is that the new government has taken up where the old one left with the bilateral treaty between the UK and Germany. This is going on, and apparently, from what I hear, it's going well. This leads me to the next point that I have labeled on my script here: transatlantic uncertainty. Really is sort of Nietzschean uncertainty. We're not talking about risk, because risk you can calculate. With Donald Trump, I think most people would agree it's very difficult to calculate anything. You have to be prepared for everything. And Merz here clearly focuses on trying to prevent the United States withdrawal from NATO. This is something he expressly mentioned in his talk with Donald Trump, and at the same time he made it clear, and it was acknowledged by Donald Trump, that the stepping up military spending for Germany is clearly fulfilling the demands that the United States has actually had for literally decades in the past. And Germany has quite shamelessly, one can say, ignored and profited from the situation of a free ride. Germany has also, this is going to be interesting to watch, Merz has installed a new National Security Council, which sits uneasily in the German institutional arrangement. It's not quite clear. It's very close to the Chancellor, but how it actually is related to the Foreign Office and to the Chancellery, that's not quite clear. We will have to see how this is going, how this is turning out in practice. The attempt, at least, is to centralize foreign policy decisions more than was the case in the past. And the situation is actually quite favorable for that, because for the first time in 60 years, literally in 60 years, the Chancellery and the Foreign Ministry are headed by the same party. And this party is the CDU, which hasn't, as you can conclude from that, hasn't held the Foreign Ministry for 60 years. And the reason for that is that the Foreign Ministry is always the favorite ministry for the smaller coalition partner, and the CDU just never was the smaller coalition. So let's see what comes out of the National Security Council. It's an attempt at institutional mimicry. We will see how far that goes. With respect to the Ukraine war, Merz has been quite clear. On the other hand, he hasn't been quite as clear as he demanded from his predecessor when he was the leader of the opposition, particularly around Taurus. He has now basically said we're going to leave this sort of in an area of constructive ambiguity. We're not going to say very clearly what we're going to do. So he has had to learn that being very rhetorically pointed and outspoken as the leader of the opposition is not something you can do when you're actually the chancellor. But he has tried to be as clear as possible in his support on Ukraine, and that has actually also been acknowledged by the Ukrainian side. So let me come to a brief conclusion. There is a paradox that the Merz government faces. It has very ambitious goals. The question is, will it actually have the resources to put that into practice? How stable is the domestic situation? The points I was making was that there is some fragility, although I would say after now a month into the government, clearly it looks more stable than it looked to many observers on the day of the failed first round of the chancellorship election. Still, internal dissent and pressure from the AfD may test Merz's ability to maintain unity within his coalition, and we will see how the Social Democrats will actually position themselves. With regard to the economic reforms, I pointed out that there is a tension between short-term goals that you can actually likely achieve and the long-term goals, and there is a contradiction between the two. So green transition, all this is taking a long time, and the government doesn't look at the moment as if it will put its focus on that, because it is of the opinion that it needs to very quickly show results. And at last point, there is a question whether Germany will be able to fulfill the leadership role within Europe that many demand of it. Famously, the foreign minister of Poland said that he was more afraid of Germany that doesn't lead than one that does lead. Whether that will be achievable will not, to the least, will to some considerable degree depend on how Germany gets its economic house in order, because it needs to be economically strong as well for that. So there is a vision, there are real world constraints, and I'm sure we will all watch with great interest how the developments will unfold. Thank you very much for your attention.
And here's the paradox. All Europeans complain when Germany leads, but they also complain when Germany doesn't lead. Go figure.
Well, Germany has been called by Willy Patterson the reluctant hegemon, and this is the hegemon's dilemma in a way. Okay.
Well, it's great that we have this session on Germany this academic year, because Germany has been central to the interests of this centre for 50 years. And also central to my own interest for 50 years. Just got a pair of bookshelves there, and you will see. And Andreas himself played a very important role in this centre in the early 2000s in the discussion around Germany and Europe, I have to say, at a much more hopeful time, early 2000s. So it's great to have you back, Andreas. And thanks for a very interesting presentation. I'm going to defer to you on virtually all the political science. And I have 3 questions to Andreas, which I hope he may try to answer, and 3 questions to Germany, which none of us will be able to answer because they will be answered in practice over the next 5 to 10 years. But I think it's important to put them on the table. My 3 questions to you, Andreas, are about the AfD, which is clearly the most concerning development. Extraordinary growth in the vote. I haven't seen the latest public opinion poll, but up to 23%. all know about the East German phenomenon of AfD. For those of you who haven't seen it, there's the famous election map from the Bundestag election. The East is not red, the East is light blue, right? But what is, I want to ask you about, is the election potential, the nature, the sociology, the determinants of the election potential of the AfD in West Germany is clearly going to make the difference. So I went and looked at the little spots. Kaiserslautern, right, in the election, 25.9% AfD. Recklinghausen 2, 21%. These sorts of places, where is the West German electoral potential? As you said, in the early days of the AfD, it was very unusual for a right-wing populist party, hard-right populist party, because it was a party of professors against the euro. And Norbert Röttgen from CDU told me the letters he used to get from the AfD, post 2015, were Professor Dr. So-and-so, or Rechtsanwalt so-and-so, or banker so-and-so. What is now the sociology and the election potential that is getting us up to that 23% figure? Second question on the AfD, I very much agree with you. Firewall or no firewall, you can't simply ignore and exclude 20% of your electorate forevermore. There has, of course, been a discussion of banning the AfD because the Verfassungsschutz has now classified it as a far-right party. My own view is that that would be a big mistake, just in practical terms. And if you want an illustration of this, look at what happened in Romania. An election was annulled because the far-right candidate Georgescu did so well, with rather dubious misinformation on TikTok. He himself was banned from standing. What happens? The election is rerun, and another hard-right candidate gathers all the hard-right vote and appears at the polling station with Georgescu. And so you get the vote both for Simeon and Georgescu. I can bet you the same will happen in France if Marine Le Pen continues to be legally banned from standing. Jordan Bardella will appear at the polling station. At his right hand will be Marine Le Pen, and you'll get both the Bardella and Le Pen. So I just think on practical terms, and by the way, to an electorate of those who feel both economically and culturally neglected, and then you say to them, and you can't even vote for the people you want to vote for, I just think it is totally counterproductive. But that doesn't address the question of what you do about it. Now, bans are proposed in the name of what in German is called wehrhafte Demokratie, which is rather oddly translated into English as militant democracy, which makes it sound like the church militant or something. What it means is a democracy capable of defending itself. And that seems to me a very important principle. But I think the focus of wehrhafte Demokratie, but I'd love your comment on this, should not be on trying to ban, except in the case of really extreme neo-Nazi parties, but on strengthening all the institutions, both political, legal, and social, and indeed media, that actually defend a democracy, even if you have this party in power. So, for example, the independence of the courts. That the courts should clearly be like Caesar's wife, absolutely above suspicion, even when these parties come to power. The independence of the civil service, or crucially, the digital public sphere, which is where these parties make a huge headway. AfD very big on TikTok, right? So public service media in Germany are very strong, but they're not so strong online. If you look at the Reuters Digital Institute study, much weaker. I would pump a heap of money into the public service media, particularly for online. That seems to me how you do Wehrhaft for democracy, not banning AfD. Third question in relation to AfD connects to that. So what we see, I think, in Germany with the CDU, as we see all over Europe, is parties of the liberal centre, left or right, trying to steal the hard right populist nationalist votes by adopting some of their rhetoric. Keir Starmer, Island of Strange, right? I'd be interested to know what you think, Andreas, of the work of our colleague Tariq Abou-Chadi and others, who I think produced quite good political science evidence that this doesn't work. That adopting the rhetoric of the hard right without effectively limiting illegal migration, which is what you were talking about, has the opposite effect. Because voters say, why should I vote for the dog whistle when I can have the real dog? I think there's a lot of good, and I think particularly with Jens Spahn, who is, of course, the hard right, if you like, inside the CDU and tempted to get into some sort of a conversation with the AfD, one might also have that temptation. What I think more works is what Mette Frederiksen did in Denmark, and which I would hope to see this government do, is indeed to be very tough on irregular migration, because that's, as you showed, a genuine popular concern, but not to adopt the rhetoric. So the practice, but not the rhetoric, and not the opposite. My three questions to Germany, and these are just to open up for the discussion. I think they're important to put on the table. First, to your point about the economy, and I think it's really important to stress just how profound is the crisis of the German business model. If you want an enjoyable polemic on this subject, read Wolfgang Münchau's book, Kaputt, the one T, well, I took it two. What he calls a neo-mercantilist model, heavy on manufacturing industry, benefiting from the famous trio of cheap energy from Russia, cheap security from the United States, and easy exports to China, all of which have disappeared, with a huge trade dependency, significant labor shortages, partly because there wasn't enough of the right kind of migration and integration, and an incredible tech backlash. I mean, being behind anyone who's traveled on the German train by getting the Wi-Fi or a mobile signal. The problem is very big. Now, it seems to me there are two questions. One is, can Germany as a whole, I mean, business, society, government, everybody, actually restore economic growth? But the second question is, will it do it in a way which is mainly national, or will it do it in a way which is more European? What I mean by more European, I mean you take the recommendations of the Draghi report and the Letter report, deeper European capital markets, more shared European debt, European digital public space, and so on, and adopt some of those against the taboos which are still very strong, particularly in the CDU. Now, none of us in this room can answer this question because we will see in the next 4 to 5 years. My hunch is that the answer to the first question is yes, Germany can do it. Wolfgang Münchau is wrong. Helped, by the way, by potentially 1 trillion euros of neo-Keynesian stimulus, half of it on infrastructure and up to 500 billion on defense. That's a hell of a stimulus to have. But also, I just believe in the capacity, actually, particularly the Mittelstand, of the smaller and medium-sized firms to adapt. Larger ones, yes, sir. But my hunch is no to the second question. That is to say, I think this will be done more in a national way. Very interesting. One of the things Matt's talked about to Trump over lunch was car exports. And what do we do about German and American cars? Trade is a EU competence. In a sense, it's not the business of the German chancellor to be talking trade and tax, but of course he's going to. And my hunch is that the politics in Germany will simply compel him to address them in a more national, rather than a more European way, and therefore the positive impact for the European economy is not going to be as big as it would be if he adopted more of the Draghi and latter recommendations. But who knows? We shall see. The question is on the table. The second question is about defense, which you talked about. Listen, I think I'm right in saying that Germany already has the largest defense budget in Europe. I think it overtook Britain this year. If not, it certainly will next year. And with 500 billion to spend in the second half of the 2020s, Germany will not only have the largest defense budget in Europe, it will be the leading military power in Europe. Think of that in historical perspective. It's an interesting position. And of course, part of the economic revival will come from producing less cars and more tanks and guns and ammunition and drones, as it has to. Nothing wrong with that. Now, I think it's quite clear that this is going to happen, that there is going to be much more spending on defense, that Germany is going to address the capability requirements that NATO is asking of it, because there's a clear list of capability requirements, and that Merz is looking to do this in a coalition of the willing. He's been very clear about that. Germany, France, Poland. But if you're going to have effective defense and deterrence, your adversary, let's be specific, Vladimir Putin, has to believe that you would actually fight, right? It's not just that you got the kit, but you'd actually fight. Now, this is not the mode in which German society has been, for very good reasons, for the last 80 years. Heinrich August Winkler talks about a post-heroic society, a society whose first commandment was no more war, never more war. And the whole language of war is completely compromised by Nazis. Krieg, Kampf, Sieg. It happens about. I had this experience. I was talking about the Ukraine war to an audience in the Allianz Forum, which some of you will know in Berlin, huge venue. And I was talking about the Ukraine war, and I was talking about the Ukrainian theory of victory. And I said, die ukrainische Theorie des Sieges. Shudder, an audible shudder went through the entire auditorium. So that all that language is, for these very good reasons, compromised. The head of the German armed forces said a few years ago that the German armed forces should be Siegesfähig, capable of winning. And there was a huge row about this. By the way, not a problem Germany has with its football teams. Now it's the word Kriegstüchtig. So I'm laughing about this, but it's actually a very serious challenge, because it is the question whether you can move German society, not just to the defense expenditure, but to have, so to speak, a martial spirit, a readiness to fight in defense of free societies, without going over the top, as it were. And I think that's a real challenge also for leadership from the top, specifically from that, finding the language. Final point very quickly, and again, this is not for you or I to answer, but I want to put it on the table because we're talking about the next 4 years. One of the greatest historic achievements of the Federal Republic over the last 75 years has been the exemplary way in which it has dealt with the difficult parts. So-called Geschichtsaufarbeitung or Vergangenheitsbewältigung. First the Nazi past, of course, the many books up here, and then the East German past, the books up there. And that has really been an absolute hallmark of German democracy. Now, in the last 3 years, it has faced two great challenges when it comes to learning the lessons from that. One has been the Ukraine war, the other has been Israel-Gaza. Now, in the case of the Ukraine war, for 75 years or 70 plus years, you've been saying, no more war, and certainly not against Russia. And suddenly Russia launches a brutal new neo-colonial war against Ukraine. What do you do about it? My view is that Germany has handled this challenge rather well. Led by many of its intellectuals, historians, specialists on Russia and Eastern Europe, it's actually found a way of talking about it, and Merz himself, unlike Olaf Scholz, has been very clear on it. Israel-Gaza war has, for obvious reasons, been more difficult because you have two imperatives for Germany that come from the Holocaust: a particular imperative and a universal one. The particular imperative is that you must always stand by the state of Israel. Angela Merkel, part of the Staatsräson, the raison d'etat of the Federal Republic. And a universal imperative, you must always everywhere stand up for human dignity and human rights, wherever they are attached. What has happened, of course, in these 20 months is, to put it very mildly, that these two have come into tension with each other. One could put it much more strongly than that. And I think Germany has had extreme difficulty in coping with that tension. If some of you want to know more about it, I've just done an essay on my history of the present Substack newsletter on this exact question. I don't want to go into all the detail, although I'd be happy to in the Q&A, as I'm sure with Andreas. But the point I want to make is simply this. I think as Germany becomes more and more not just the leading economic power, and in fact the central political power of Germany, but the leading military power of Europe, the question of how you learn these lessons from the past, both in our own continent and around the world, is going to become more and more critical. And the danger in Germany is that you stick with a kind of rigid, frozen version of what lessons you should learn from the past, rather than a dynamic one which responds to circumstances as they change. So those would be my three big questions to Germany: the economic, the defense, and, so to speak, the historical moral questions. I'm looking forward to Andreas' questions. Answer to my questions to him.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It's been splendid and in great detail. And I'll see the ones where you actually sort of expect answers from me. I hope I can provide some. And on the other side, perhaps offer some comment. The three questions on the AFD was, the first was about the potential of the AFD. Two things about that. And it's a pity I can't project something here, because you held up this one chart, and I have two more which were very interesting. But first of all, political science has measures to gauge the potential for a party. And here, in a way, the good news is that the AFD seems to have exhausted its almost completely, which is at around 25 to 27% at the estimate, compared to, for example, for the SPD in the mid-40s. So, and if you look at the CDU, it's similar. And the Greens, it's sort of in the upper 30s. So the AFD has been very successful in actually realizing its potential if we accept these figures, and I have no reason to doubt them. So what is more worrying, however, is that your picture only tells a part of the story because it has offered many, perhaps, can I hold it up again? This one, exactly. This was the one which sort of basically leads you to believe, oh, the AFD is just a problem of the East. It's not. It's not. Because if you look at, I have another thing here, which is if you look at the second strongest political powers, what you have is actually, you have the CDU in the East, and you have the AFD there where Germany is economically strong, i.e. in the southwest. This is Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Rhineland-Palatinate, Hessen. This is where the AfD is the second strongest party if you look at the Zweitstimmenverteilung. And the SPD is the strongest party where Germany used to be economically strong, i.e. North Rhine-Westphalia and Lower Saxony, where the heavy industries still are. And so what you can conclude from that is that a lot of the voters are actually afraid of their economic situation. They're not in a problematic situation, but they are afraid that things may change. They're actually people who are quite well to do, but they feel insecure. And for whatever reason, they think that voting for the AfD helps with them. Now, people like you and me might doubt that, but this is just the situation that we face. So in that respect, I would say it's both good news and bad news, because we don't see that the AfD has much further to go, particularly now we don't know yet how this will play out. If the Bundesamt für den Verfassungsschutz assessment of sort of this being a, what's the precise wording, a gesichert rechtsextreme Bestrebung. Wonderful bureaucratic German. So if that is the case, which at the moment they're not allowed to, they've actually withdrawn that temporarily, but it will probably end like that. The discussion is now already, if you are an active member of the AfD, can you actually be, say, a policeman or something like that? And these are things that we don't yet know how this will play out for the support for the AfD. But the bad news being that it's not limited to the Aussies who are just mad and behind and all that. It's far more complex, and German society needs to more proactively engage with that. And the whole left of the political spectrum, or everybody left of the AfD, needs to come out of their comfort zone and actually sort of address this and rethink things, because they've, in a way, I think, dug themselves into a hole. Which brings me effortlessly to your second question about whether the banning of the AfD might be a good thing. And I fully agree with your assessment. It's my assessment too. This would be a big mistake. However, I see that the things are sort of moving in that direction. Well, and it's a very delicate balance, and there is a lot of distinctions here. But in the Bundestag, for example, people have been collecting signatures. There are many, and I would say all of my colleagues from public law are very critical and very skeptical that this will, they point out that A, this will take a long time, B, all that we know about written stuff from the AfD does not actually sort of come up to the level of actively undermining the constitutional order. Quite to the contrary, the self-image of many in the AfD is that they're actually protecting democracy. So this is complex, and for me, ultimately, if I have to bring it to a sort of simple formula, it is that you cannot defend liberal democracy with illiberal means. You need the open confrontation, and I think that would be far better. We've talked about democracy prepared to defend itself. That's how I always translated it, because I didn't like militant democracy either. But in my lectures here, I try to call it democracy prepared for self-defense. Problem is that the polarization is such that everybody sort of to the left of or many to the left of the AfD think it's actually helping their own side if they advocate a banning of the AfD. And there is something to be said for that. It does really help them, but this is not a very good development. I'm very unhappy, but if I have to explain why many in this debate do not actually follow the advice of those who have thought long and deeply about it and have can claim some level of expertise, then I think it is that you are sort of feeling at last to be on the right side of history, and this time you're going to really fight them. It's also something that you can find in much of the church, in much of the church responses. They want to this time they want to be on the right side of history. Is it actually right to try to? Can you defeat them by, as you put it, stealing the populist vote by adopting their rhetoric? I would have loved to discuss that at length with Tariq Abu-Chadi, who I agree is a very good political scientist, if political science means being extremely capable in detailed survey interpretation. And he is quite representative for a large number of people there who say that, no, you can't do that, because the standard saying is people will then opt for the original rather than the copy. While I find this rhetoric quite unpalatable, and I was angry about the Island of Strangers, maybe you saw the YouGov poll on the day after, which said that the criticism came from the supporters of the Labour Party. Actually, many people thought Starmer had hit the right note who were thinking of voting reform, which to me at least raises the question, at least he gets into communication. That's part of the problem that I see. To me, in some way, much of the now past or totally Tariq Abu-Chadi school is very unpolitical, because they seem to be sort of very geometrical in how they think these things happen. When Macron dissolved the Assemblée Nationale, he was criticized for that, but his strategy behind that was that the Front National, how are they called now? Rassemblement National, that they should actually sort of be faced with having to leave the government, and then he expected to see them fail. Didn't work very well. It didn't work very well because he lost control of his own side, and they mobilized very effectively, and they defeated them. But the question is, what do you do if these people can promise you everything and never have to prove it? Shouldn't they be put on the spot? That's something I wonder, and I haven't got a simple answer to that, but I have my doubts. Would it not be better, for example, to have the AfD in some sort of minority situation in one of the German Länder, and then it would actually become evident that things do not massively improve from day one, and they would no longer be able to make that claim. I think, in a way, many people are letting them get away with too much easy rhetoric. And so I have my doubts in that respect. Denmark is indeed, I think, a very interesting example, but talk to German Social Democrats about it. They think that the Danish Social Democrats are a despicable group of people. In many ways, that is certainly not the case, because they're very effective in terms of maintaining a very generous welfare state, and they profit from that electorally. But
Andreas, can I just tell you, if we can get something?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, okay. Yeah, it's too long. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So, I think, 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 I So still in the popular zone, I'm not decided on that, but I have my doubts on Tariq Abu Chabi's interpretation. It seems to me to be too easy. Just very briefly on the points about the economy.
Very briefly.
Very briefly. I was here 20 years ago when Germany went through its last period of misery. I remember Xian Smiley from The Economist interviewing me at length about how hopeless the situation was for Germany. I would just point out that Germany has very often come back from the economic dead. I would not underestimate its ability to do so. Again, it's not a promise that it will do, but I'd be very cautious about that. And I've heard it very often in Britain. They try to convince themselves that this time around, Germany is really done. Let's see. And Wolfgang Münchau, in that respect, of course, is very much has been in that school again. On defense, can I just say that I think the mood has really shifted in Germany. Can I point out that the Greens are the most credible supporters of Ukraine? I've heard, for example, prior to the election, I was in Berlin. I heard one high-ranking Green politician just mention in his presentation, oh, by the way, he had just notified the authorities that he wanted to withdraw his conscientious objection and he would register to be a reserve officer. I think something has changed in Germany. It's quite clear, and the Greens are sort of leading that. And on last point, Merz has not joined the criticism of Israel put forward by a combination of France, the UK, and Canada, but he has done his separate criticism later. At least the response from the Israeli side now was that they were acknowledging it. I think it's a complete dilemma, and I don't think there's a good way out of it. And I would not sort of say that I know a solution how to get out of it, but it's clear. So sorry for being so long. Thank you.
Raise your hand. Okay, let's get three. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. My name is Nick Allen. I just wrote my master's thesis about the Zeitenwende, and I spent a lot of time studying parliamentary debates and thinking exactly about this stuff. And you just point towards the Greens and their sort of reinvention of themselves in regard to defense policy. And I would disagree with you that that's a sign of Germany is changing. I think they are changing. It's kind of remarkable how little others are changing. I'm looking at like specifically appointments like Göttingen, the Ministry of Defense now was a key advisor of Chancellor Scholz, who's now being rewarded for previous policy. My actual question, who do you think that AfD clearly has a vision for Germany? I would suggest the Greens do too. Who else does? And is it perhaps one of the reasons that people are pushed to the left, the Greens to the AfD, because there's a vision there and SPD and CDU jointly lack one, perhaps?
Yes, thank you very much for the fascinating presentation and the discussion that followed. We discussed about the divide between the east and the west part of Germany regarding AfD's electoral power and the potential that it has in the west. I remember having seen before the election some polls, opinion polls, on how Russia is perceived in the east and the west of Germany. So I would like to bring into this discussion perceptions about Russia and how Russia is presented among the far right from the AfD, but also in this discussion about the war. So does it play as a factor of how to bring the electorate close to the AfD, or is it not a powerful argument?
I think you raised it. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Super presentation, Antony and Sherlock for Europe. And I have a question really about this rightward shift in both UK and Germany. I mean, I think taking that our full approach to it, both the AfD aren't doing quite so well in the opinion polls as Farage and his friends are doing in the UK. Not much consolation, mind you. But I wonder whether the common feature there is actually dark money from both east and west In other words, from Putin and from some of the more extreme elements in the Republican Party in America, but also whether the German electoral system will have implications. I mean, we're talking now about the possibility of Farage as Prime Minister, which would be a dreadful prospect. I'd be interested to know whether you see anything similar happening in Germany, or whether the electoral system will affect the Germans from that disaster.
Thank you. Who would like to start?
Andreas.
Let me start with a question about the Greens. As far as visions are concerned, I'm so old that I am a member of the Helmut Schmidt School on Visions, which you probably know, which means that if you have visions, you should consult your physician. And I doubt that the Greens really have a vision. I mean, it did not work well with them, with their most visionary leader, Habeck, who has now gently withdrawn. He will sail off to, I think it's Stanford, for a year, as his fellow former party leader sailed off to New York. We don't yet know. But the question is whether Germans haven't had enough of visions, because, I mean, Habeck really gave us an overdose. And they would just prefer some pragmatic but working good governance. So in that respect, particularly with the Greens, I think the Greens, we really don't know yet, because there is a leadership vacuum there that's quite evident. We don't know who's going to fill it. And it's worked very well for them since 2017, when Habeck and Baerbock came in, but it may also revert to the time before, and it wasn't very successful. Differences between the East and the West in the perception of Russia are certainly an interesting thing, and in a way one could, and I don't understand enough about it, because to my simple mind, I would have thought that after 40 years of deutsche-russische Freundschaft, you would actually be inoculated of having too rosy a view of the Russians, but it's not the case. And what you can see is that actually it's the, which is very strange if you consider the AfD to be right-wing nationalist, because a right-wing nationalist should actually oppose your country's most evident adversary, who sort of threatening you. But it's actually more, it's my foe's foe is my friend. So if Vladimir Putin is credible against wokeness, then I'm his friend. So I don't understand that, I have to say, but it's a fact on the ground, and you can see it if you look at opinion polls in Eastern Germany. And it's part of the problem that I talked about, that Merz is facing with his own party, both in parts of his own party, but also because of the strategic behavior towards the AfD. The right-wing shift, I've gone and looked for it in German data, and I haven't found it. I think there is no evidence that attitudes have changed and moved to the right. What has happened is a different electoral behavior. But the reason why I don't resort to other explanations like right-wing shift or dark money from Russia is that I have an explanation that can, to my mind, very well explain why electoral fortunes of the AfD have gone up. And that is that there is at last a party that occupies a room in the political space that many people have demanded, had demands for before. And that is the change. But I can assure you, and I've talked at length with my colleagues in political sociology about that. If you look at left-right self-placement data over the last 15 years, you will find no change. It is, as it was, slightly skewed to the left, and you have a sort of overall aggregate, sort of slightly left-leaning group that is about 1.3 to 1.5 times as big as the world. So there is no violent shift in that. So about Farage as PM, again, my colleagues in this very August university, like Ben Ansel at Nuffield, can tell you at length why they think it's very unlikely. But I agree with your pointing at the problem of the electoral system. Yes, electoral system here is an effective wall until it isn't, and then it collapses completely. And that's the difference to the German electoral system, but also, of course, the federal system, where even if you've conquered the center, there's still a lot of other areas that other political forces can dominate.
Thank you.
Very quickly, 3 comments. First of all, pro-Russianism. AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht, who is even better. People say, oh, Eastern Europe is going to be anti-Russian and Western Europe is going to be, more sympathetic. Not true. The dividing lines are much more complex. Northeastern Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, but equally Finland, Sweden, Denmark are anti-Russian. Historical experience. They have experience of Russian imperial aggression and Russian domination. Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, different empire, different historical experience, different set of attitudes. And, East Germany is this kind of weird standout case because of the complexity of the history of the Second World War and of communism and so on. But it's simply not true that Eastern Europe equals anti-Russian and Western is where the sympathies lie. Second point on Reform UK, Peter, the irony of Reform UK is that the most anti-European politician in British politics is actually demonstrating and in fact creating the Europeanization of our politics. Because Reform UK is a classic continental European hard right populist nationalist party. It's a Fratelli d'Inghilterra, Alternativa für England, right? and so as a result of Brexit, the great proponent of Brexit is actually driving the Europeanization of our politics. And as Andreas just said, we're beginning to get in some constituencies a sort of 4 or 5 party system. And the question is, does the 2-party system ultimately hold in 2029 or not? The worst possible outcome is what's happened in the United States, when the Farage figure or the Alice Weidel takes over one of the 2 big parties. Last quick comment, Andreas, to something you said about the AfD. I think one has to distinguish between, and I think this is important, 2 propositions. One is, it doesn't work for mainstream centrist parties to adopt the rhetoric of the hard right without having effective policies. That's a proposition I would say. Now, your proposition was a different one. Maybe if these guys are getting so many votes on these issues, let them have a go at sorting it out. And I think one has to distinguish between those 2 propositions. The latter seems to be much more plausible. Let's see what happens to Fratelli d'Italia in the next election.
Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I was actually very grateful pushed back by Professor Busch for the map and say age electoral because I find the map highly misleading because it's just more voters for the AfD in Western Germany than there are in Eastern Germany, just because of the vote share is significantly higher in Eastern Germany. But what I do think is that, especially also recognize this as my friends and also former work colleagues, this kind of narrative that it's still an Eastern Germany problem, and I wonder, is this kind of distancing by Western Germans kind of point at that issue, and this issue in the East will have to deal with this? Why is this narrative still so dominant in news media, among politicians, but also among the wider public?
Yes.
Okay, I had wanted to ask a question on Israel-Gaza, and I think you touched upon it already. What I find very interesting is, or I think Merz's recent statement, I think it was last week, is quite a shift in Germany's stance towards the whole Gaza issue. I think he called it incomprehensible, right? What's happening, or Israel's military conduct is incomprehensible to him. So I would be interested in two things or two issues within that. The first one is, what do you think is Matt's strategy? Why he's, as far as I know, the only German politician who's been so outspoken about the issue. Why did he make this statement? And secondly, do you think this changes Germany's international stance as well? Because Germany has been criticized a lot for not speaking up for what's happening. And now Germany has spoken up about it. So do you think this is also a shift on how Germany is perceived on the international?
Thank you. And can I add my question as well? And then we'll have another one. But my question regards Merkel's legacy. Because if the economy is not growing, if there is an anti-migration kind of feeling in Germany, which is very much pronounced, if there's been such a failure in understanding what Russia was up to from a German perspective, what does this leave for Merkel as a legacy, you know, for the Conservative Party, but also for the whole of Germany, I suppose, for the Christian Democrats, and then for the, you know, for the whole of Germany.
Certainly, yes. Sorry, this is well. Let me just start with that. Germans have somehow very quickly fallen out of love with Angela Merkel, and so you doubt whether they were actually very much in love with her to start with, or whether she was just convenient and acceptable. I don't know whether one is fair in pinning all the blame for all the problems that have come up since on her, but certainly one can say that Germany, and she was the chancellor at the time, faced with a big refugee wave, or whatever you may call it. I mean, it's just a tremendous amount of people coming to the country in 2015 and the years after. They did not think about what would that mean, what would that require in the years to come. For example, the dire situation in many schools now, because there is insufficient capacity, and you have lots of kids who are unprepared to actually be schooled because they don't know the language. It's that sort of thing where there's clear failure, because it's one thing to say we're prepared to help and we will manage, wir schaffen das. But then the next thing should actually be, what does that mean in detail, and what will we need in 3 years' time, in 5 years' time? It's foreseeable, and you know when the kids will be in school. And this is just one example. About the economic situation, I would say that one should not overestimate the capacity a government has to actually govern the economy. This is to a considerable degree. My criticism would more be towards business who have failed in that respect. Question why the AfD in East Germany is so dominant. Who asked that? Oh, yes, of course, you. Is it perhaps because it's a very comfortable position to be in? I mean, East Germany, the thing is that the East-West German discourse is very often implying in a way that these are sort of two equal parts, when one is in reality less than a fifth of the other. And that is why your figure is true. Yes, there are more votes for the AfD in the West, but the West is 5 times as large. So per capita, of course, it is again, of course, stronger in the East. This has been in a way a dialogue of the deaf, with the West German position being for a long time, you should be grateful, we bail you out, and the East Germans sort of basically saying, oh God, 40 years of the Russians and then the West conquered us. When the correct position would actually be, look who voted for instant unification. Look who voted for instant currency union. And I can say that because in 1990, I spent a lot of time trying to argue with East Germans that if they went for instant currency union, it would create disastrous unemployment on their part, to which they replied, we don't know unemployment. We have the exact opposite problem. And so, yes, it's been a failed dialogue, and again, both sides have basically dug themselves in and are sitting in their respective trenches. On the Israel-Gaza question, why did he say that? I think because one has to say that Israel's actions are completely incomprehensible if one thinks of them from a perspective of the state of Israel's self-interest. They become more comprehensible. I don't say comprehensible. If you think of it as the actions of a government that is fighting tooth and nail to stay in office. And I think this is something that a cold-nosed assessment of the German position has actually brought up, that you should not confuse Bibi's government with the interests of the state of Israel, and we only need to look television every evening to know that this is not the same thing. So I personally am very happy that he has actually made that step. Because this, to many outside Germany, seemingly unquestioned, sort of standing behind Israel, whatever they do is incomprehensible, and it has actually hurt Germany's esteem in the world. So I think I'm very happy that the new government has taken that opportunity. So,
I wonder whether Eastern Germany should have probably gone through a membership process like the other East European countries did.
Well,
that would have been too radical.
That's another seminar. And as you know, there's a book by Garton called The Othon, an Invention of the West, which I think is at best a half-truth.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an attitude problem.
He's a scholar of Germanic language. He is not a social scientist, but he's earned a shitload of money from it.
But just to be clear, the point I was wanting to make waving this, which is we have a good understanding of the AfD in East Germany. But if it's really going to become an order of magnitude bigger problem in German politics, that will be with West German votes, not with East German votes. And that was the point of reference. You don't get to 20% or 23% only on East German votes. You've got to have West German votes. I would add that somewhere on these shelves you can find one of my many misjudgments. Because do you remember in the early 1990s, people were saying, oh, East and West Germany are going to be divided for 40, 50 years to come. It's going to be like after the US Civil War, the American North and South. And I was saying, no, nothing of the kind. It will all come out in the wash, apart from the outside Berlin, and it's not a bit of it. Now, I do think that there is a counterfactual in which, both in policy terms, the process of unification, but also in, so to speak, attitude terms, how both sides spoke to and about each other, one might have taken a different path. I do not think it was inevitable that you would have this degree of kind of social psychological alienation 35 years after unification, but it's a fact.
Can I add just very briefly one thing? The party system plays a very important role. Part of it is that the left party of it was still the PDS at the time, was basically playing up sort of the injustices towards the East, and that didn't play well in the overall party system, German party system. What you now have is that party membership in the East, in all of the East German länder, is about a third of what it is in the average of the West German. And you have two parties that are sort of overproportionate in terms of membership, and that's the AfD and that's the left party. And this means that all the other parties literally have hardly any influence. I think for the CDU, I did the numbers. If I remember correctly, it's about 4% of the CDU membership are in the East German Länder. I mean, there's simply, if that main mechanism of transporting preferences into government and into the parliament does not work, then you just don't make use of the instruments that a party democracy gives you. And that's a large part of the problem. Of course, I know East Germans always say, well, we've had to be members and all that. But that is, we need to look at it in these respects, I think.
That raises the interesting question whether Die Linke should continue to be treated as also a kind of pariah and not democratic party. And of course, Friedrich Merz only became elected chancellor because they made a deal with Die Linke, which is one of the minor ironies of the story.
I think we've reached the time where we have to put a stop, sadly. I should have said from the beginning that because I see some new faces, that we are surrounded by the TGA kind of book collection. And this section here is on Germany. Tim himself has curated this library here, and people can come here and have a look at the books and stay in this room and
not take them away.
Exactly. But thank you again, Tim, for this very colorful library of modern European history. But I need to thank Andreas very much for your talk and for giving us this really comprehensive story of where Germany is today, but also Tim, for your wonderful remarks and your thoughts. And thank you all for coming to this seminar today.
This is the second step.
Second one is looking at tonight. Right?
But it's
amazing how inspired.
How contemporary.
Have you seen this map?
This is the right, yeah, he said that. So this is the second.